This brings us to my 8th point. What are the possible scenarios in the event of a crisis like the present one? Well, specifically there are 4. I have managed to examine 4 in analytical terms. There may be more, but these 4 are textbook scenarios, and in real life, any combination of them is conceivable. The first scenario that might unfold with a financial crisis and an economic recession like we are experiencing in April of 2010 is perhaps the most damaging, despite appearances, and it is a recreation of the bubble. Political and monetary authorities respond to the crisis with massive doses of new expansion, sufficient to halt the processes that trigger the crisis, and the bubble is created again. In the book, I explain that if this is possible, it is at the expense of making the financial crisis or economic recession far more severe when, sooner or later, it inevitably hits. In fact, we have a precedent, because this is what happened in the crisis of 2001-2002. As you will recall, Alan Greenspan became alarmed and raised interest rates, and the crisis was unleashed. However, immediately afterward came the attack on the World Trade Center on September the 11th, 2001. It was considered a matter of national interest that there not be a crisis under such circumstances. The President of the United States took Greenspan aside in representation of all the central bankers, and they decided to recreate the bubble. It was a hair-of-the-dog measure, like a drug taken for 6 more years in order to muddle through until 2007, when the crash happened. During that time, we lost the opportunity for what would have been a healthy, necessary readjustment, and a constellation of investment errors were overlapped with another constellation of even graver errors, and that has led to the really critical situation we now find ourselves in. This first scenario, the recreation of the bubble, has been to blame. Under the current circumstances, I do not believe that in most parts of the world there is a serious risk of this first scenario unfolding again, except perhaps in China, for instance. Take note of it, however, and use it to analyze and interpret what happens in the world. The second scenario is the opposite extreme. In this case, the financial crisis leads to the collapse of the entire fractional reserve banking system. Lehman Brothers fails, and people immediately get scared. And although it was an investment bank, its failure is followed right away by that of Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and then Citigroup, which actually did also go under. AIG is saved, though it supposedly insured what was uninsurable. Everyone's credit default swaps. Terror abounds, as I was saying. Everybody in Spain is frightened too, and people all rush to the banks, the Banco Santander for instance, to withdraw their money. But the money is gone, and poof, the banking system disappears. All of the banks fail, and the financial system collapses. This would be a tragedy, because it would amount to a money squeeze. All we would have left is cash, which is 1/10 of the money supply. Imagine, for instance, how much prices would have to be adjusted in the event of such a money squeeze. It will be a devastating blow, which would do away with the economy as we now know it, and we would have to start all over from scratch. Well, this tragedy has been averted, so to speak. However, it is awkward to explain, thanks to the bank bailout performed by central banks. In any case, what I want to make especially clear is the very fortunate position central bankers find themselves in, since, as I was saying before, they present themselves as the saviors of the country. Well, they are, and they are not. Central bankers should remember that they have shown up to extinguish a fire they themselves started with flamethrowers. And that is the second part of the story, the part they do not tell. So you, central banker, were the one who, in the prior stage, orchestrated credit expansion, the bubble, and the situation we now find ourselves in. Of course, with the terribly designed financial system we now have, at least bail out the banks so that everything does not come tumbling down, but then we are going to sit down at a table and talk. Because your first order of business will be to disappear, to do away with the central bank, and to bring back a gold standard, fully private money, and a system in which all economic agents act based on general legal principles. That is, a 100% reserve banking system. In other words, put out the fire you started. But once you have done that, your firefighting days are over, and you can turn in your flamethrower. Notice how central bankers seize the opportunity to say, the capitalist system has survived thanks to us. All of this must be said. It must be said out loud. It must be said in lectures. It must be said on the radio. It must be said on television. It must be written in books and articles. We must be insistent and repeat it again and again. Well, you know how the bailout happened, starting with the famous $700 billion super bailout plan to purchase toxic assets in the banking system. This plan was all Barack Obama could talk about before he lost his 80% approval rating. Indeed, as I have explained, when the market discovered that banking assets were worth a fraction of what was thought, the federal government purchased the deficient portion, putting $180 billion into American International Group, which had insured banks. £360 billion was the amount in Britain. Other governments, including Ireland, Portugal and Greece, simply guaranteed deposits by decree. Still others either completely or partially nationalized the banking system, as occurred in Belgium and the Netherlands, for instance, with Fortis, ING, ABN, Amro Bank, etc. The entire financial system has been virtually on the brink of disappearing. Well, that scenario did not play out. Let us say, with reservations, fortunately the system was saved. However, two more scenarios, the third and the fourth, are possible. The third is what I call the Japanization of the economy. What does the Japanization of the economy consist of? Well, it consists of government intervention in fiscal and credit matters that is so intense that although it does not manage to recreate the bubble, it ends up at least blocking the spontaneous market processes which tend to correct the investment errors committed during the bubble stage. As a result, the economy remains indefinitely in a recession. That is what happened in Japan. And the country is another typical or paradigmatic case to which the Austrian theory of the cycle can be applied. There was a huge bubble in Japan in the 1980s. In Tokyo and in the other main cities, real estate, land and offices came to be sold by the square centimeter. Large Japanese companies boasted that they were finance companies which were devoted to speculation, but which, on the side, produced either transistors or computers or some other product. And all of this crumbled into a financial crisis, an isolated, so to speak, cycle connected with the famous Asian crisis of the 1980s. However, in Japan, for institutional reasons, real investment errors are very difficult to rectify. The Japanese believe that workers must be loyal to their companies, and vice versa. So, the Japanese central bank instructed that there be a continuous loan rollover, and that all companies be permitted to repay their bad loans with newly created loans from the banking system. The entire banking system became insolvent, and basically a pyramid scheme organized by the Bank of Japan. In addition, the government took every possible measure, both Keynesian and otherwise, to overcome the crisis. Japan became the country with the highest percentage of public debt in the world, together with Botswana. Public works were built, and all sorts of measures were taken. But Japan did not come out of the recession. It went on for 15 or 20 years, and right when it appeared that Japan would recover, boom, the grave new international crisis hit the country. The economy was ailing and feeble. Without a doubt, Japan is a very wealthy country. It has a great deal of invested capital, but increasingly it has seen other countries in the Asian Rim gaining the positions it has occupied. That is the Japanization of the economy, and to a certain extent the Spanish economy suffers from it. Our economy is part of the European Union, and in relative terms, our economy is more rigid, particularly the labor market, and this accounts for the fact that, other things being equal, unemployment in Spain is twice what it is in other countries of our region. Note that even in Greece and Ireland, with an enormous amount of malinvestment, unemployment is half or less than half the rate in Spain. You see, in Spain, we have inherited labor relations structures created by General Franco during the dictatorship, and none of the democratic parties has dared to dismantle these structures. From Franco, we have inherited two misfortunes which no one in our democracy has dared to touch: the labor relations system and the social security system. These two creations of his are dearly loved by modern social democrats. Now we come to the fourth scenario, and it is extremely important. This is the scenario I believe is now unfolding. In spite of all the obstacles and difficulties, and in spite of mistaken interventions and demagoguery, the market is highly dynamically efficient. Because the market is all of us. The market comprises millions and millions of people who go out of our homes every morning with enthusiasm, or more or less depressed depending on the circumstances. But we go out to try to provide for our families, run our businesses, and put our balance sheets on a sound footing. And that reflects a powerful drive or force which is capable of rising even above our politicians' most nonsensical remarks, errors in institutional design, absurd interventions, demagoguery, and so on. So, despite the obstacles, the market eventually gets back on its feet. That is, it realigns itself. In fact, sometimes this happens very fast, even surprisingly fast. For instance, in Spain, 150,000 companies disappeared in a period of 6 months. Entrepreneurs in Spain have made a tremendous effort, regardless of their politicians, who are totally out of touch with reality. Spanish families and entrepreneurs have made a huge effort to salvage what could be salvaged, to put their balance sheets back on a sound footing, to repay their loans, often bearing heavy losses, and to let go, very reluctantly and at an exorbitant cost, many workers. They could have kept many of them on. They could have avoided laying them off if labor relations had been more flexible. Many of the companies that have completely disappeared might have been able to survive if they had not had to pay such high workers' compensation costs. But despite the difficulties, the realignment has taken place. I believe that now, with the unemployment rate at 20%, and with nearly 5 million people out of work in Spain, the remaining economy is virtually healthy. And I have seen plenty of signs that this is the case. It is healthy in the sense that the companies and lines of production are viable and generating a profit. Nothing like the exorbitant, crazy profits being made during the bubble period. We have to put that behind us. If the Spanish economy is to be sustainable from here on out, it will be a cool economy. An economy with sustainable and therefore modest growth of around 2% and no more. And the vital, unfinished business of reabsorbing the 5 million unemployed workers, of reintroducing them into the circuits of wealth creation, will be dealt with only once the labor market has been reformed, and the liberalization methods everyone knows are necessary have been taken. The Vox Populi is calling for these measures. Everyone knows what must be done in Spain, but nobody dares to bell the cat, due, among other factors, to the harmful incentives in a democratic system. For politicians fear, and with good reason, that the moment someone takes such a measure, he or she will be voted out of office. In the case of Greece, for instance, that is why it has been so fortunate for the country to be in the Eurozone. That way, politicians can say, listen, this is being imposed on us from outside. Voice your concerns to Angela Merkel and the IMF. And everyone complains and blames Angela Merkel, or the representative of the International Monetary Fund, or obscure conspiracy groups. And the poor politician, who has nothing of the statesman in him, and if he did he would lose the elections, says, I have no choice but to do this. We will go bankrupt if I do not. The austerity experienced by families is also clear, and is due mainly to an increase in uncertainty. In many cases, numerous family members are unemployed. Hundreds of thousands of families are in a desperate situation because all of their members are out of work. This is a social tragedy, and it is vital that institutional reforms, particularly in the labor market, be made as soon as possible in our country and in the rest of the world, so that these unemployed workers can be absorbed as quickly as possible. And it is not only in the labor market that austerity is important, it is also crucial in the public sector. Without a doubt, automatic stabilizers push up public spending, and therefore, if we do not want the deficit to skyrocket, they will have to be compensated for by austerity. Ordinary citizens and companies are all tightening their belts, so certainly the state should do so as well. And the last thing we need is a rise in taxes, because we need to have available to us the greatest possible amount of income in order to rehabilitate our companies, put our balance sheets back on a sound footing, and repay our loans. If our taxes are raised, we have less available income left, and the readjustment process is lengthened. More than anything else, we must reduce bureaucracy and regulation. The situation is shameful. Scratch the surface in any sector, whether energy companies, or power companies, or banking, or insurance, or restaurants, and you will find that everything is regulated by a labyrinth of official rules. The fact that any entrepreneurial project is ever carried out in any sphere in our country is almost incredible. We have become accustomed to the drug of regulation. We are used to asking Papa State for more and more regulation, and now to dismantle this is going to require a huge effort. Let us not go to the extreme that Italy did in creating a ministry to dismantle the intervention of ministries, because that is adding even more regulation. In any case, let us be aware, take part in demonstrations, and raise a popular outcry against so much statism, so much arrogance from public officials, so much arrogance from bureaucrats, and so much pontificating from politicians, and all of it intended to organize our lives.